Thanks everybody for coming today and hearing my thoughts on the first 6 months using Harvey. It's an exciting time. It's a really powerful tool, and it's something that I've wanted to talk about for a while. And so it's been fun to sit down and consolidate all of my thoughts about it. Um, it this is in some ways a best practices presentation, but that's not really the focus of it. And it's also not really about legal or ethical risk of using AI for legal work, which is something that has been written about a lot and talked about a lot. I wanted to do a presentation that is basically just one litigator's observations 6 months into adopting this product and using it pretty extensively about how it can improve my work product, how it can save me time, which translates into cutting client costs, tasks for which Harvey and any of the generative AI products, they're really just not ready for showtime. And I just wanted to sort of share that and let people know what they're good at and what they're not good at. I have clients now all the time saying like, should we just draft a complaint to see what it looks like? Why don't you just use AI and see drafting a complaint would be in the category of things that you cannot use AI to do yet. And then talk about some things that I think just generally clients and litigators should know about using these products as we march forward into a world of broader adoption. I'm not covering in this presentation how generative AI can help with doc review. That's a whole other topic, which I have thoughts on and some experience with over the past 6 months. And if we have time at the end, I'm happy to field questions on that, but that's really a whole other thing that is not sort of the subject matter of this presentation. Before we get into it, I just want to issue a little disclaimer here. I don't work for Harvey. They're not paying me to do this. I don't even think they know I'm doing this at all. This is just my observations of using their products. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, and y'all can take them for what they're worth. And the other thing I'll mention is that pretty much everything I discussed today is not really specific to Harvey. So KVP, we also have an enterprise ChatGPT license. I use that as well sometimes. But a lot of what I'm talking about today, you could do with Harvey, you could do with enterprise ChatGPT. If you have enterprise Claude, you could do it with that. There are some specific things about Harvey that make it particularly well suited for some of the things that I use it for, and we'll talk about those. But sometimes I use I use like ChatGPT for other tasks that we'll talk about. I find it better for some things that are less legal specific and more sort of fact investigation specific. And so we can talk about what the differences are today. So next slide, please, Amy. So my high level thoughts are the following, which are AI doesn't think like a lawyer and it can't replace lawyer judgment, but it is a phenomenal force multiplier if it's used the right way. The humans are still going to need, John Connor to lead the resistance, but having the Terminator obviously helps a lot. So the main things that it helps with are understanding and finding things in large volumes of documents. And we'll talk about how to do that, what that's helpful for. Probably the thing that I'm most excited about, and that for me at least has improved my practice the most, is helping me come up to speed faster where my cases involve complicated businesses, complicated technologies, very, very voluminous contracts with lots of addenda that I just need to master very quickly. It's incredibly helpful for quickly getting up to speed. It's very, very helpful for brainstorming ideas. What are all the different possible ways to think about this? Because in the brainstorming context, it doesn't matter if some of those ideas are hallucinations. You'll research them, realize they're hallucinations, and leave them on the cutting room floor. Some of the other things that it comes up with will be great and maybe something that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of. So it's a very helpful partner in brainstorming. It's very, very helpful for stress testing. So critiquing and improving written work product, getting a second sort of set of eyes on something. If any of y'all have ever worked with somebody who, is a very seasoned lawyer, very smart person, might not know the exact law and the exact jurisdiction, might not know the facts of the case, but has a good general sense of just legal reasoning, and they're down the hall from you, and they're just sort of a sounding board, like, hey, I'm working on this case right now. What are your thoughts about this? Harvey and ChatGPT both do a phenomenal job with that. And then the last thing is turning the chessboard around. So one of the things that I think is most difficult sort of the further you move away from law school and clerking, if you clerk, into litigation, is you spend so much time thinking about one side of the case, which is your side. And a lot of the stuff that we do requires us to turn the chessboard around and think about the case from the other side's perspective. For example, if we're preparing a witness for a deposition, we need to be able to think through, like, if I were the lawyer on the other side, what are the documents that I would use? What are the admissions I try to get? What exactly am I trying to do with this witness? Or if you're preparing for an oral argument, you have all the briefs, but you don't have a tentative ruling from the judge. You can ask the LLMs to create a tentative ruling and create all the talking points for your opponent. And it might not be exactly what they come to court with, but just sort of seeing that from the other side's perspective can be very, very helpful in framing what you want to do at the hearing. What it's less useful for, strategic decision making. It can help you create a list of pros and cons for any strategic decision you might make. It cannot weigh them contextually with human judgment. It just can't. And so it's very, very important to not delegate decision making, or even I prefer to use queries that don't even really ask for a recommendation. I prefer to use queries that say, help me think of all the different factors that could impact my decision making. And then it's up to me to look at the factors, compare them to the list that I created beforehand, weigh them appropriately, and then make a recommendation to the client. Tasks that require precision, or that have to be grounded in actual source material. So I know everybody's heard these horror stories of how lawyers ask AI to create a brief and it just hallucinates wildly. That's just one example of things that AI can't be used for in that context. You cannot ask AI, what is the correct answer to this legal question under the actual controlling law and the specific facts of our case. It will not give you reliably. It might come up with the right answer. It might not. It's predictive, right? So you can't rely on it for that. You really need to make sure anything that requires precision, you do yourself. The last thing, and this is one we'll talk about a lot today. I do not think that any of the LLMs are particularly good at original legal writing. And by that, I mean taking a rough outline and some source material, tossing it in there and asking it for a draft of a brief. And in fact, we'll talk about this in a second. KVP's AI acceptable use policy does not permit us to do that, but I've kind of like, after writing a brief, just see, I have it now just to see how Harvey would compare to that. I've done that sort of as an experiment, and what it comes up with is not very good. And honestly, like, I think at this point, everyone can kind of tell, at least people who do a lot of reading and writing, I think, can kind of tell what's been written by AI or inflected by AI and what hasn't. So I don't use it at all, and nor do any of the lawyers at KVP for creating briefs or anything like that. So before we get further into this, I just want to do a sort of quick summary of our acceptable use policy for AI. Next slide, please, Amy. Okay. Oh, these are my high-level thoughts. Next slide after that. Okay. So I think probably the thing that clients are most concerned about with any sort of SaaS product that a law firm might use is data protection and confidentiality. And so we instruct all lawyers at our firm not to do anything that could even remotely have client confidential, privileged, sensitive, client identifying information. You cannot enter it into an AI tool unless the firm has vetted that tool and approved it for attorneys to use for work purposes. And at this stage, there are only 3 such tools: Harvey AI, Enterprise GPT, and Crane Patents, which is a patent-specific LLM. All of those tools have been evaluated for compliance with our confidentiality and security standards before approval was granted. Number 2, every output must be independently verified. So anything that it comes up with, before an attorney sends it to a client, uses it in a brief, does anything with it, it has to be checked, it has to be verified. AI may not be used to replace attorney judgment, and it also cannot be used to to create original drafts of court filings. It can be used, and it is very helpful, as we'll talk about later, in helping edit and revise things that have already been drafted, or in helping to come up with the ideas of what should go into a brief. At the beginning, it's very helpful for brainstorming. At the end, it's very helpful for revising. In the middle, we still do that. And lastly, we monitor our attorneys' use of AI and queries that attorneys enter just to make sure that there's ongoing monitoring and compliance with the policy. So I just wanted everyone to be aware of that before I continue talking about all the ways that your lawyers are using AI to help you. Next slide, please, Amy. So this is the landing page for Harvey when I log in, and I've redacted on the left anything that could be client identifying. And so I made up this like test case, and so this is the landing page for a case. So the way that Harvey works, that's a little bit different than the other LLMs, and why I like to use it and find it very helpful, is that within Harvey you can create basically a replica of whatever share file system you're using to organize case files electronically. And so I can create folders that have all the correspondence, all the depositions, all the discovery that's been served, and so forth. I also create for each of my cases what's called a projects folder. So anytime I have like some project that I want to do on Harvey, I'll take all of the source materials that I need for that project if they're not already on here, and I'll just toss them into a folder. And then when I enter my query into Harvey, I can choose which of the different files Harvey is going to reference in coming up with an answer. And that makes it just a very, whereas for some of the other LLMs, you have to sort of manually add files each time you want it to run a query. Here, I just have the whole thing ready to go. I click boxes based on what I want it to reference. A lot of times I'll just click the entire pleadings folder if it needs to incorporate knowledge of what's happened in the case to date. And that accelerates the process of bringing the LLM up to speed on all the different background sources that it needs to reference in coming up with a good answer. There's also a table feature in Harvey, and it's kind of difficult to show it to you without showing you client confidential information. So I'm just going to explain basically what it is. If you click on the button that's above the area where you can enter your query that says review table, what you can do is create a table that describes all the set of documents that you reference, and it'll describe each document in a different row on the table. And then in each column, you can use natural language prompts to say what you want. And so this is a powerful tool that you can use if, for example, you've got, here's a good example. If somebody creates a deposition binder of all the exhibits that I might want to use for a deposition, and I want to quickly get a sense of what's in there before taking it home for the weekend and reading through the whole thing, I can put all 200 of these documents into a table, and then I can have it organize the documents chronologically based on whatever date field it can find on the face of the document. And then I can have it summarize generally what the document is like, and it'll come up with sort of a pretty accurate summary, email from so-and-so to so-and-so regarding such and such. And that's just like a very, very powerful tool to create chronologies or to wrap your head around large sets of documents without taking the time initially to like sort of read through them carefully. Again, I still have to read all of those documents before I decide if I want to use them in a deposition. And some of the little summaries are actually probably going to be wrong. Harvey's pretty accurate, but not 100%. We'll talk about that more in another context also. So obviously we still have to read all the documents, but for my own, 30,000 foot, do I need to ask the associate to like get a whole bunch of other documents because there's an entire subject matter that's missing from this? I can figure that out without having to read the entire binder just by creating a table. Does anyone have any questions about the Harvey interface and how it's different from other LLMs before we move further into the discussion? Okay, so let's move to the next slide, please, Amy. Okay, so here are the things for which I now frequently use Harvey, and I've already sort of given a high-level overview of these, but I'm going to sort of talk through each one of these in depth now and provide a few real-world examples. Number one, understanding and finding things in large documents and files. So again, Harvey will search text searchable documents that are uploaded into that sort of file structure, which is, Harvey calls it a vault. If you want, you can ask Harvey to look through large volumes of documents in various folders in the vault. It can write a memo that describes what's in there. And what it does that's really, really useful that I haven't found any of the other LMs are able to do reliably yet is it will footnote its findings. And then you can click the footnotes and it will immediately pop up a sort of like a PDF pop-up that takes you right to the place in the document where Harvey got that information. So what's super helpful about that is if you get a memo that summarizes, for example, say you take a case over for another law firm and it's midstream and there's a whole bunch of different motions that are pending. And oh my goodness, there's a hearing set for a week from Friday on all of these motions. And you need to quickly get up to speed on what's at issue in all these motions, how are they relevant to the case, and so forth. You can put all of the briefs into a query for Harvey and ask it to summarize all the legal issues in all of these briefs. And it will organize it, summarize it, footnote it. Then you can go through it and click on each footnote. And as you're going through, very quickly verify whether Harvey summarized this accurately. And you will find mistakes here and there, but you'll be able to identify them quickly. And then, of course, again, you then have to go and read all the briefs before the hearing. But as you sit down to do it, because you now have this background context, it's almost like giving it a second read rather than a first read. The rate at which you're ingesting and processing and thinking strategically and preparing is much faster. Um, there are other things, I mean, and that's sort of more of a strategic use case. There's a more practical use case, which is I have I have some like two or three partners, I'd say, who have photographic memories. And they'll say things like, opposing counsel admitted that thing in that email from December 3rd. Can you pull it up and send it to me? I do not have that. One of the things that I like cannot do is remember specific emails at that level of recall. For me, it's more like I'm pretty sure opposing counsel admitted that thing. It's in the correspondence somewhere. I need to cite it in this discovery letter that I'm writing. Okay, now either I or an associate needs to go back through, the correspondence and find it, and that might take an hour. Now I can just ask Harvey, hey, Harvey, where are all the places where opposing counsel may have admitted the following thing? And then I just have it review the entire correspondence folder in Vault. And in 20 seconds, it will come up with the answer. And I can check by clicking on that footnote. And the last few times I've done that, it was exactly right. I mean, that saves me an enormous amount of time, or an associate an enormous amount of time, and an enormous amount of cost. So that's a very, very powerful feature, is just being able to find things that you kind of know are in the document somewhere. It's you go to trial and you've got an exhibit list with 2,000 exhibits. What was the exhibit where the key witness said that one thing? You just type it in natural language, Harvey finds it. I have I used this recently in the middle of a hearing where there were, we were the plaintiff. There were several different defendants, and the several different defendants had collectively filed, more than half a dozen Rule 12 motions. And so the briefing was hundreds and hundreds of pages. And a lot of it was kind of repetitive, but sort of not totally repetitive. And so we needed to find very quickly on the fly where one of the defendants had admitted a certain thing in the factual background of one of their Rule 12 motions. And that's something that, in the olden times, just forget it. There's no way I can find that fast enough for it to be useful in the middle of a hearing. Um, the but with Harvey, I was able to find in 2 seconds. So it's super, super powerful for being able to find things in large volumes of documents, which, the needle in the haystack assignment is traditionally something that takes a long time and is something we have to do occasionally. And now it's much easier. It can also help unpack large and complex documents. And so I'll give an example from like a non-lawyer context, and then I'll sort of that maybe everyone can relate to, and then I'll sort of transpose it to litigation. So if anyone's ever like purchased a house and gotten a disclosure packet with all the other, inspection reports and everything like that, it's a pain to read through that whole thing. One of the things you can do now is just put that in ChatGPT or Claude and say, what are the things that are most relevant here that I need to know about? And can you point me to where they are in the document? You can do the exact same thing for example, if you've got a startup client and you need to understand all of the corporate governance documents, you can put them in there and say, what are the things that are unique about this or that are unusual in the corporate documents, or if you have a specific question about how the corporation is organized, what are the rights of the Series A preferred holders with respect to amending the charter, whatever it is. You can just enter that prompt in there, and Harvey will point you to where in the corporate documents it is. Same thing with a closing binder for a complex M&A transaction. These are all things where if we've got a case that involves that set of documents, we need to invest a lot of time learning what's in there, understanding them contextually, and AI can dramatically accelerate that process. I'm going to pivot to the next topic, but I saw that there is a question, so let me get to that beforehand. See how Harvey. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. My pleasure, Janet. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is coming up to speed faster. So um, again, one of our challenges as litigators in complex commercial cases is sort of pivoting from a case that might involve biopharmaceutical manufacturing to a case that involves security fraud to a case that involves, trade secret theft in a commercial context for SaaS companies. It could be like totally, one thing to another to another. It can all happen very quickly. And each time we need to reorient ourselves and become subject matter experts in the area in which our case is. And that involves usually a lot of background research, a lot of client interviews, and so forth. Being able to have a dialogue, and this is one where I mentioned earlier, I actually find ChatGPT to be better than Harvey because ChatGPT just has a broader knowledge base and is, the premier or one of the premier LLMs. Um, the I just find it better for this type of thing. And I'm going to give you some examples of how I use it in a second. But making sure that we are able to have a dialogue to make, basically create custom Wikipedia articles that are super informative about our clients' industries or about the job responsibilities of a witness whom we're about to interview is a way that you can save an enormous amount of time, but also improve the depth of your knowledge dramatically. So one way you can do this is understanding inside baseball documents. You're going through the initial set of documents that were sent by the client, and there's an email that uses a lot of jargon, and it sort of assumes a knowledge base that you don't have. You can put that document into GPT or into Harvey and prompt it something like as follows. High level description of the case and who your client is, high level description of the client's industry. Okay, so in the context of my client's industry and given the background of the case that I just explained, can you help me unpack what's going on in this email and what the sender is trying to communicate to the recipient as it pertains to this business and these issues? And it will do a really, really good job of that. Really, like consistently, really, really helpful. And then if you have to go ask a witness about that document, you're not approaching the witness like, okay, so what exactly do you do at client ABC? And okay, can you take a look at this email? All right. What's going on in this email? I mean, you can get way past that. You sit down with the witness, you already know what they do, what their job responsibilities are, how they factor into the client's overall business. You already have a baseline understanding of what's going on with this email, and you can get right to the sort of meat of it. It's an incredibly powerful tool. So another example, this is from a recent case that I worked on that involves software as a service companies and the sales pipeline for those companies. So in talking to salespeople that work for like a large sales organization for a SaaS company, there's a ton of jargon because there's all sorts of different stages at the sales funnel, and there are different acronyms that correspond to the people who work on each stage, and then the types of leads that are generated at each stage, and whether they're leads or opportunities or all that. I mean, it gets kind of confusing. There's new leads and new sales, and there's cross-sale opportunities, and then there's a whole, there are other departments that work on other issues related to existing customers. And so just trying to like create a mental org chart and understand for each witness, what is this person's role within the broader context of this whole business operation? Backgrounding myself in all of that with the help of GPT was enormously successful because I had sort of a glossary of all these acronyms before I sat down with the first witness. And I had an understanding of all the different things generally that they do. And I could spend the hour. I mean, you all know it can be very difficult to get an hour of a senior executive's time to talk to a lawyer in a case that you're managing. It's probably super frustrating if lawyers sit down and the first 20 minutes of that hour are spent asking questions that are so remedial, it's just frustrating. Um, we can now blow past all of that and sit down and get right into complicated factual disputes or questions that are really impactful for our position in the litigation. And so one of the things that I'm now instructing all of the people that are doing witness interviews on my cases is, please, before you talk to somebody at the client, don't walk in blind. Make sure that take your outline and then and take the documents and go into Enterprise GPT or Harvey and try to figure out as many of the answers as you can before you go and talk to the witness so that you can focus your time with the witness on things that only the witness can tell you and that you can't find somewhere else. And that I think is it's a big time saver for us. I think it's also a great way to sort of multiply the force in terms of it being a force multiplier. If we get an hour of someone's time, we're now using it as best as we possibly can because we don't need to use any of it for backgrounding ourselves. It can also help you come up to speed in terms of identifying factors that could impact strategy recommendations. And I think the best way to explain this is going to be by reference to an example. So imagine a startup client that wants to settle a founder's dispute. And the other side, the ousted co-founder, recommends, why don't you create a new class of share so that they want to settle the founder's dispute. They want to transfer equity to the ousted co-founder. Your client doesn't want to give them any corporate governance rights. They're trying to figure that out. So the other side says, why don't you create a new class of share that lacks the following corporate governance rights, but has the same value as common stock, and then you can transfer me shares of those. Whether the client wants to do that is mainly a decision for the client and with advice from their separate corporate counsel. We don't advise on corporate governance issues and stuff like that. We are litigators. That's not our job. However, the client might ask something like, am I giving up too much? What are the risks of the litigation, and how do you weigh those risks against the problems that are presented by this construct? And in order to advise the client in that context, I need to have an understanding of how this new class of shares construct could potentially impact the client's business operations or what problems it would pose. And in order to do that, historically, I'd have to spend some time with the corporate governance documents and then talk to their outside corporate counsel and really invest a lot of time wrapping my head around this. Now I can go into Harvey and I can load all the corporate governance documents as they exist into Harvey. And I can ask it, a series of questions like, what are the potential benefits and risks to the client of the structure proposed by the other side, given the client's stated goals of reducing the following types of interference with corporate governance? What governance documents would need to be amended and how in order to effectuate this? What additional provisions should the settlement include to make sure that it meets the client's goals? What other potential constructs could address the client's concerns without having to create a new class of share? What questions should I ask corporate counsel before recommending the new class of shares approach? These are all things that I need to know in order to give good advice to the client. And if I get grounded through an LLM before I have the conversation with corporate counsel, I'm still not going to offer any advice to the client on this until I talk to corporate counsel, feel like I'm fully up to speed, feel like I know enough about it to give a strategic recommendation in the lawsuit. But in order to get to that point, in order to get to the point where I can have a productive conversation about that with outside corporate counsel, I can accelerate that dramatically by having a conversation with the LM. Okay, last example, and this is I think one of my favorite things that I've done since I started using Harvey. That's been just in terms of how it's maybe not saved me time, but just made me a much better lawyer. So I call it solving the first hour of the deposition. A lot of time is often wasted with what I would describe as really open-ended questions about the deponent's career background and job responsibilities. The first hour of a deposition is often a total snooze, and beyond wasting time, it lets the witness get comfortable And it kind of establishes in the witness's mind that the questioner lacks subject matter expertise. And so the witness starts to get a little bit more confident and starts to play games a little bit more. And it kind of makes the entire deposition a little bit more difficult. And I have found that GPT and Harvey can help me cut through that extremely fast. I'm going to give you an example from a recent case. So this was a contract dispute between our client, which was a large company, and its vendor for a SaaS product that it used for its business. And we were deposing the SaaS vendor's chief revenue officer. We had a strict time limit on the deposition. We had a lot of things we needed to cover. We wanted to establish early on that the chief revenue's job functions would require that he knows that our client was its biggest customer, the SaaS company's biggest customer, and that he was necessarily aware of all the customer success issues that our client was having with their product, and that he was aware that our client was a known churn risk. And so we wanted to pin him down, not generally on like what his job responsibilities are, because the chief revenue officer does a lot of things. We wanted to pin him down specifically on what his job responsibilities included that would allow us to establish those things. The other thing we wanted to do, which is something I want to do in every deposition, is build momentum early in the day by establishing my subject matter expertise, showing the witness I'm not there to mess around and they're not there to mess around with me, and getting into a flow where I'm asking very well-crafted questions that don't give the witness a lot of wiggle room and require yes or no answers so that they're not sort of leaning back and giving sort of long, non-responsive answers all day. So those were my goals. And what the team and I that were working on this deposition did was we went into Enterprise GPT and had a series of lengthy conversations about what CROs generally do in SaaS companies. And then we looked at the document set that we had for this particular person, and we looked at their LinkedIn profile, and we got confidence that a lot of the things that ChatGPT was explaining this person necessarily does are probably things this person does. I mean, it's just sort of clear from their meetings and their emails and so forth. And so instead of walking into the deposition with questions like, well, what are your primary job responsibilities? And then getting an open-ended list and then picking one and being like, okay, so with respect to this thing, tell me more about blah, 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 blah. Instead, I walked in and I'm just going to, I've anonymized all this, but I'm just going to read the sort of series of questions that we started with. Okay, you're the CRO of the company. In that role, you own the company's revenue number, right? You set, and by the way, let me just pause. The other advantage is ChatGPT can explain things in industry jargon. And so one of the things that lawyers often struggle with in depositions is they're asking questions in sort of layperson's terms because their understanding of that client's industry is sort of a layperson's understanding, or at least it's not an understanding based on just sort of years of accumulated institutional knowledge. And so the jargon doesn't come naturally. And so they ask questions like, instead of saying you own the company's revenue number, they might say something like, so am I right that you're responsible for sort of setting a goal for how much revenue the company generates in a particular year? And maybe that's fine, and maybe they'll just say yes and you can move on. But other times they'll act confused, or they'll ask follow-up questions, or they might be genuinely confused. And so it's just very, very much easier if you can incorporate industry jargon that they're going to necessarily be familiar with into your questioning. Okay, so in your role as CRO, you own the company's revenue number, right? You set and own the annual and quarterly revenue targets and forecasts. You're accountable for the company's top line annual recurring revenue target. You and your team build and maintain the company's revenue model, and you run periodic meetings with your organization to discuss the company's sales pipeline. You also discuss periodically the company's sales forecast and churn risks, right? Your role as CRO requires you to know which of your customers generate the most revenue, right? You routinely receive and review lists of your top customers by ARR and by total contract value, correct? So your role as CRO requires you to understand how much of your revenue is concentrated in its top customer accounts, right? Your role as CRO also requires you to know which large customers are at risk of churning, right? And it requires you to understand why they're at risk. So if your biggest customer was a known churn risk, you as the CRO would know that, correct? And you would know why it was a churn risk, right? Um, and my client was a large customer account before the relationship ended, right? In fact, it was the largest customer account in terms of ARR during the entire customer relationship that you had with that company, correct? And am I correct that my client was a known churn risk during your tenure as CRO? And you were aware before the end of the relationship why it was known at your company that my client was a churn risk, correct? Okay, let's talk about that. So I think maybe there were one or two of those questions that the witness didn't just say yes, but that saved me probably an hour of going around in the dark with a flashlight, trying to get the person to say things about their job that I could then ask more questions about to get to where I needed to go, which was you knew they were the biggest customer. You knew they were having customer success issues. You knew they were a churn risk. You knew why. Let's talk about those. It's just an enormous, enormous force multiplier for going in and asking very, very, very targeted questions to get exactly what you need, and then establishing along the way that you've got subject matter expertise. Because not only did I get done in, maybe 10 minutes or less, what would otherwise take me an hour, but I've also now established a flow for the day. And I've shown this person, like, I know exactly what CROs at SaaS companies do. So please don't mess around with me or it's going to be a long day. I would strongly encourage people to use the LLMs for those purposes. Okay. Number two, or I guess, sorry, number three, brainstorming ideas. I'll move through the next one faster because I do want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. Brainstorming ideas. I find I'll just give you three examples and then we'll talk more broadly about it. So potential arguments for briefs, potential discovery requests to serve, potential third parties to subpoena in a particular case. Anytime you're sitting down and brainstorming things that you might need to do or arguments you might want to make, it's a very, very helpful thought partner. Caveat, I find it infinitely more helpful if I spend the same amount of time as I otherwise would have doing the same thing. So this isn't a task where it actually saves time. This is a task where it helps you think a little bit better. If a lawyer uses one of the LLMs to brainstorm ideas before going through the same process as they otherwise would to come up with the ideas on their own, or I shouldn't say it that broadly. I can only speak to my own personal experience. I find that if I do that, it tends to sort of constrain my thinking, is how I describe it. Like I end up not being as creative with the things that I think about because I'm sort of biased initially in favor of whatever the LM comes up with. It'd be like, yeah, the best analogy I can think of is if anybody plays fantasy football and you're doing your fantasy football draft and the platform you're using to draft players has its own list of rankings, people end up just drafting with a bias towards whatever the rankings are that they see in front of them. It's more helpful to just have your own list and not look at those. Same thing here. It's really, really helpful to come up with your best ideas first and then brainstorm and have an iterative discussion with the LM rather than asking the LM to do the job for you. Because then you're sort of plugging holes in your thinking or expanding your horizon rather than just using, an LM instead of your own brain to set the horizon. Turning the chessboard around, this one is critical. So I mentioned earlier how helpful it is in oral argument prep. What I now do before every major oral argument, again, after I've thought through my oral argument, after I've drafted my own speaking notes and refamiliarized myself with the briefing and basically gotten to the point where I'm, 90% ready to do the argument, at that stage, I ask for a tentative ruling. I just say, forget which side I'm on, look at all the briefs, look at all the exhibits, hear all the cases that are cited in all of them, hear all the PDFs, review all those, and issue a tentative ruling. And it might be right, it might be wrong, but it's just helpful to look at. And then sometimes if the tentative ruling is in my favor, I'll say, okay, go back and do a tentative ruling against me. How would that look? Because I don't know what the judge is going to do when the judge comes out, and starts the oral argument. Sometimes it's just extremely helpful to see anything other than what's in your own mind in order to orient your thinking in a way that allows you to move quickly and anticipate surprises. I might ask it to issue, drill down on a specific issue. Your tentative ruling didn't thoroughly address this issue. This is the issue I'm most worried about. Issue a tentative ruling that goes against me on this issue. What would it look like? Another thing that I now always do is I ask it to draft my opponent's speaking points that it anticipates. Then I'll give it my own outline and I'll say, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this oral argument? What are some things that I should be concerned about and address that aren't addressed here? So just in terms of like having somebody put a second set of eyes on my work and having someone spar against me in my work so that I can sharpen my analysis and sharpen my points. It's not a time saver, but it is an amazing force multiplier. And I found that I've been better prepared for oral arguments using that approach. Again, not asking it to just come up with the oral argument prep on its own, but using the approach where once I'm ready, then I spar against the LLM rather than just wait till I have my actual opponent in front of me to go. It's in the same context, you can use it to get the other side's perspective on a strategic decision you might make. I'm thinking about doing this. How would you expect the other side to respond? Mock trial presentations, super helpful. I've always found that at a mock trial, there's always a bias in favor of the mock jury going in favor of our side because we think about our side all the time. We don't spend as much time thinking about the other side's side. And so almost inevitably, there will be greater depth of analysis in our presentation than the other side's presentation. And it can be really hard when you're, a few months out from trial to take yourself out of your own headspace and put it in your opponent's headspace. Assistance from the LLM can be really, really helpful here. Okay, drafting. This is one where I have found that there are some things it can do very well and some things that it does not do very well. So on the same sort of wavelength as what we're just talking about, which is critiquing and sharpening and sparring, I find that if I have a fully drafted brief, it's super helpful to put it in Harvey, ask Harvey to query all the different cases and sources that are cited there and all of the background material that might be helpful, and then ask Harvey questions like, what are the biggest weaknesses in this brief that you can identify? What are some questions that are left unanswered by the brief that you would have if you were the judge that we could do a better job addressing? What do you think the strongest parts of the brief are? How can we improve the introduction to play harder on the themes that are in our favor? So just sort of the same sorts of things that I'm thinking when I'm reviewing drafts and when I'm revising and when I'm preparing things to send to a client. I ask Harvey to put a second set of eyes on, and I'd say like 50% of what it comes up with is pretty helpful. Another 50% is like completely unhelpful and is a just hard no. But 50% of what it comes up with improves the work product. And so it allows us to create work product that's sharper and stronger. It's also very helpful for drafting what I would call simpler documents. So for example, if you've got a detailed term sheet for a settlement and it's a pretty simple term sheet, and now you need to sit down and draft the settlement agreement, that's something it can do. And again, you have to review it carefully, probably compare it to exemplars from other similar cases. But it saves you like the actual time of just, hammering out the party names on a keyboard and everything like that. It cranks it out quickly. Meet and confer emails or letters, things like that. But anytime you ask Harvey to draft, it's really, really, really important to have a detailed outline and to have copies in text searchable format of all the source material that you need it to look at. And you need to include all of that in the prompt. It is not, you cannot give it a simple prompt and expect it to come up with something that's well structured and useful. It needs to be at the point where you're almost ready to just take a detailed outline and convert it into something. And then Harvey can help sort of like fill in the gaps and generate something that just, it saves, a couple hours of typing. But it is not, again, you cannot do that for briefs. It won't get the tone right. It'll sound like it came from an AI. Even if you give it a detailed outline, I found it sort of comes up with its own way of structuring it or doing headings that is not particularly helpful. And you end up spending so much time iterating with it and sending it back to the drawing board and then editing it that I don't think it saves any time at all. Plus you're starting from inferior work product. So it's just, hard no on creating a draft of a brief and using it as something is your starting point for a draft that you file with the court. It's very good for getting past writer's block. So I find sometimes when I'm writing briefs, I write a paragraph, it doesn't really sing, it doesn't quite come together the way I want it to. So one of the things I can do is I can put that paragraph into Harvey and then explain in a prompt sort of what I'm trying to do thematically, what I'm trying to accomplish with the paragraph, how I want it to flow with the rest of the section, and then ask Harvey for line edits that would better accomplish that purpose. And I've actually found it's an amazing resource for that. It really does think of like a good, sharper way to say whatever I'm trying to say. And then I'll have to revise it further to make sure it's tonally correct or whatever. But it's very, very good for just getting past that kind of, this introduction just doesn't quite hum the right way. It's good at helping me get out of that sort of block. Because in the olden times, I'd have to put it down and go do something else for a while and get a cup of coffee and come back to it, try again. Now it's kind of just like a quick way to reorganize my thinking about a particular thing. It's very, very good at editing for word economy. So if I've got a brief that is over the page limit and I want to get it under the page limit, it will give me word economy edits that are very, very good. Saves a lot of time. That's something that lawyers spend a lot of time, litigators spend a lot of time worrying about word limits and page limits. And Harvey is a big, that's just like a time saver. But yeah, in terms of DOTs, like it can't originally draft briefs. It really can't outline particularly well yet. And then anytime you ask it to do line edits to work product, you need to review those edits really, really carefully. You could ask it to propose a series of line edits to better articulate the following point, and then it'll show you a red line of your draft. And 50% of the edits it proposes actually do what you asked it to do, and the other 50% could be like non sequiturs that you absolutely cannot put in your draft. So whatever it comes up with on the drafting front, you need to review very, very carefully. So that's a lot. Before I just sort of go to things that it's not as good at, does anyone have any questions? All right, hearing none. Amy, next slide, please. Okay. So here are the limitations of Harvey and the other AI tools. And it's pretty straightforward. Original outlining and drafting, we've talked about a lot already. Strategic decision making. So we've touched on this previously, but I just want to make sure that I'm putting a really fine point on it so that I'm explaining what it is limited in doing. Any strategic decision in litigation requires identifying all the different factors that could impact the decision, and then in some way weighing them with respect to whatever you're trying to accomplish. And sometimes you can do that solely within the context of litigation. Other times, there might be something that would be strategically advantageous for your side in the litigation, but that would run up against one of your client's other business goals. You need to understand that also because you need to know how hard to push for what you're doing in the litigation, when to not push because you understand, like your client gets it, but it will run up against this other business goal, and you don't want to burn credibility with your client pushing really hard for this thing. In order to understand all of those different factors, see them all, and sort of understand how they impact the client's business or impact litigation, brainstorming with AI is great. Getting explanations from AI on what the factors are and how they impact the business or impact the litigation are great. But assigning weights to them is human judgment. It's really, really, really difficult for the AI to reliably do that. And part of that is because every company is different. The personalities in every company are different. Every lawsuit is different. The momentum within a lawsuit could be different. Maybe you've won the last 3 motions to compel, and so the next motion you file is the one that's like going to let you get sanctions. And so you really do want to make this motion, even though it will require you to, say things on the public record that in some sort of tangential way could be unhelpful for some other aspect of the client's business. It's worth saying to the client, look, I get that, but if we file this and win, it's going to put a dagger in the other side. Whereas, like the LLM might not fully understand those considerations. It could also be that this is just a regular motion to compel. The client's got concerns about the PR blowback of something that you might need to say. Oh, get it? Fine, no worries. We're not going to do it. We'll find something else to do. So in terms of assigning weights to the different factors that impact a strategic decision, it really requires human judgment. but it is very helpful in figuring out what the different factors are and how to start thinking about it. And then, of course, the last thing is tasks that require precision or have to be grounded in source material. Again, can't stress enough for everyone who's listening. And I think this is, for all of us as we use AI more and more and more, stuff that requires you to actually know the exact right answer needs to be independently researched. One of the advantages of Harvey, again, is that if it's a citation to the record, Harvey will include a footnote that makes it very easy for you to check, but you still have to check always, every time. So that's it. We've got 10 minutes left. I'm happy to answer any questions, or if folks want to talk about document review, happy to talk about that also. But please let me know your thoughts and just type them into the chat box.
There's one question there, Ben. Can Harvey or other LLMs effectively review, locate, summarize documents produced in Discovery that are poor copies or not clearly legible?
Uh, Good question. And there's actually sort of two layers to that question. I'll handle the legibility question first. Um, I have found that none of the LLMs have particularly good ability to read documents that are like photocopies of handwriting or anything like that. For documents that are, computer printed and then photocopied, maybe it's like a file from a witness's desk that was printed out in, on a piece of paper. It's like an email that was printed out on a piece of paper and then it's scanned. I also find that the LMs don't have very good OCR capabilities. They really, struggle. I don't know why. It's a simple task. But what I do for stuff like that is I put it in our Adobe Acrobat, enterprise tool, and I run an OCR in the document before I put it in Harvey. And then that solves the legibility problem. If the document is intact enough to OCR accurately. Um, the what In terms of reviewing documents from a document production and summarizing them, again, it can do that, with 80% confidence, but I don't rely on it for that unless it's sort of like I need to get a 30,000-foot view of what's in a large group of documents before I actually start running searches and analyzing them myself or asking an associate to do that. So it can do that, but it's not, if you want like a very, very detailed summary of what is in a set of 50 really important documents, I would still strongly recommend having the lawyers review the documents. Now, you might want the lawyers to use the LMs to bring their subject matter expertise to bear on reviewing that set. And that's something that is sort of, on my case, is now mandatory for everyone, is we all need to be subject matter experts. And we don't have an excuse anymore for being slow on the uptake because we have these incredibly powerful tools that can teach us things super quickly. But it's not quite ready to, even if it can understand, like read the documents, it's not reliable at understanding them contextually. Oh, I see. Oh, I see now. Okay.
A
Sorry.
couple more questions. One person says, we have addressed guardrails that the firm uses, recommends.
Mhm.
On the flip side, are we finding that clients are requiring slash strongly encouraging KVP to use AI for certain
Yes.
aspects of the work?
Yes, and that's exactly why I wanted to give this talk, or one of the reasons why I wanted to, which is we do now get a lot of pressure a lot of it is in the context of, let's think about doing this, and then we say, okay, but like that's going to be a large investment of time and expensive, and then the client says, well, can't you just use AI to do that? Or I get this now sometimes, the client, um, I'll send a strategic recommendation to the client, and the client takes my strategic recommendation, puts it in their own LM, and then just sends me what their LM says and says, like, the LM is telling me that we shouldn't do this. So, like, and I'm like, okay. Um, so yeah, we do get, I guess that's not totally that. The second example is just a frustration that's a little bit tangential to what you're asking. But yes, we do get requests from clients to use AI to accelerate things. A lot of that is in the context of doc review. Clients really now want us to explain, either use AI for first level document review or explain to them why we can't for a particular doc review. Um, and the short answer there, I'll just sort of, I mean, we can do it, but the problem is that it's not as reliable as a first level human review using a team of contract attorneys. And so it requires an enormous investment of time and money to quality control the output from the AI. And unless you're talking about a set of documents that is absolutely massive, it's not a huge time saver. One thing it can do, though, that is incredibly helpful and that I have started using it for in more doc reviews is it's very good at filtering out like complete junk. So if you get a document done from the other side and a lot of the stuff in the documents are like, subscriber emails or news alerts or industry alerts that hit on keywords that you agreed to use for the doc production. So it's just like a bunch of junk mail from one of the custodian's inboxes. AI can filter that out very, very quickly, and that saves time for the human reviewers. But more than that, I think it's very important to have human reviewers actually do the doc review. Now, look, 2 years from now, 1 year from now, 5 years from now, I don't know. At some point, I do think AI is going to be very good at that, but it's not quite there yet, just based on my own sort of relatively small sample size. Clients also do ask us, like, oh, it seems like you spent a lot of hours writing this brief. Have you thought about asking AI to generate the brief? And what I've said in those contexts, which is 100%, my experience is, A, I don't think it would save costs, and B, because I'd have to spend just as much time iterating it with it and revising it and so forth, and B, then it wouldn't be as good at the final stage. And C, like we can't, like our policy prohibits us from doing that anyway. But
A couple of real quick questions before we jump off
yeah,
to the next program. Someone's asking, do you have preferred doc review tools for at least a first pass? And another person says they had MS Copilot hallucinate documents in doc review. Is that a
yeah.
known problem?
I've never seen that happen in doc review, but the hallucination thing, like, it has not been solved. One of the things I started using Harvey for my oral argument prep is I'd give, 50 cases that are cited in the briefing, and I'd say, for each one of these cases, draft a paragraph that has the procedural posture, the background facts, the holding, and how it impacts the issues in the briefing. And it would spit out like 50 summaries, and 45 of them would be spot on, and five of them would be just like insanely hallucinated, like, an antitrust case that it characterizes as a patent case, like way off. And so it's this, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if it's making the same kind of mistakes with document reviews. We have used, in cases that I've been on, a vendor called Silo, which I think is pretty new, and then the Relativity AI tool. And my experience with that, I haven't seen them hallucinate. I haven't heard of them hallucinating documents. It just doesn't surprise me at all. In terms of applying complicated issue tags or really like getting an understanding of what's going on in the documents and who the important people are and when the important meetings were and what the important decision points were, it can't do that yet. What it can do is, help you flag documents that might be privileged. It can help you filter out obvious junk. And then it can help you if you like, it's very powerful for typing in natural language queries. So rather than having to find documents you're interested in using date restrictors and carefully constructed keywords, this term within 50 words of that term within the same sentence as that term, you can just enter a natural language prompt like, can you find documents, but there are emails between these people discussing this topic? And it'll return some things that hit on it and some things that don't hit on it. But once you find the ones that hit on it, then you can craft like really good keywords and find all the rest of them. So there are ways that you can use generative AI to accelerate a doc review. But in terms of first pass issue coding, I continue to advise against it. And I have not seen it done in a way that I feel like is reliable and that I would stand behind if challenged in court.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. This has been great.
Absolutely. I'm so happy that you all came and that we had a chance to go over this stuff. And if anyone has any other questions about how we've been using it here at KVP or how I use it personally, I'm more than happy to follow up. So thanks very much.